Thank you for joining us today at Naturally Scott. I'm Scott Harris, and I'll be your host on this journey as we discuss birds, wildlife, parks, nature, and the environment. At least once a week, I'll bring you the very best of America's spectacular world of nature, from birds to mammals to reptiles and amphibians, from soaring mountains to endless plains, from rugged coastlines to rivers and streams. Every episode will feature an expert guest, a ranger, a researcher, a birder, an author, a biologist, or an adventurer, someone who has seen what we want to see and been where we want to go. This isn't just another nature show. It's a safari for your eyes and ears. Now let's get started on today's adventure. And as always, stay curious. Hello and welcome to Naturally Scott with Scott Harris. I am so excited today to welcome Drew, or Joseph Drew, I believe it is, Joseph Drew Lanham, to the show. Joseph and I met when he agreed to be a guest in my book, Why We Love Birds. And Drew was a great guest in that book, was an obvious invite to be on the podcast. And we've got an awful lot to talk about today and some great things to cover. And from my last conversation with Drew, I will tell you that you will enjoy this conversation and it will leave you wanting. When we get to the end, you're not going to say, okay, that's about all I think Drew has to share with me. You're going to say, we've kicked open the door and we have lots to talk about, whether it's about what it's like to be Black in America or a Black birder or a poet or a teacher or a wildlife conservationist or any of these things. Each one of those could take on an entire podcast, but we're going to do what we can today. Now, Drew is intimately involved with Clemson University. He is so much more than Clemson University, but I got to tell you, the man got his bachelor's at Clemson. He got his master's at Clemson. He got his doctorate at Clemson. He teaches at Clemson. And I believe your wife works at Clemson.
Yep.
Is it fair to say
My whole family works there?
Okay. Is it fair to say you know your way around the campus?
Somewhat. It depends on the day, Scott. They're building they're building everything so quickly that sometimes from day to day it's hard to recognize what was what. But almost 100 years family-wise in Clemson University.
Wow. Now, you mentioned that your whole family works there. You've got 2 adult children, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And they're both working at Clemson?
They're both working at Clemson. Here's the thing. They didn't want to initially, neither one of those children wanted to go to Clemson. They went to school there. And as a South Carolina state employee, you get no benefits from going to having your kids go to a state school. So we thought they would go elsewhere and they didn't. And then somehow they're still there. I think I have some of the reason to that rhyme that's built in an old wives' tale, but maybe we'll cross that bridge at some point. But needless to say, I went in a place that they told me that if I went in it, that I would never leave Clemson, and here I am, still here. So
you guys are aware, you and your wife and your children, that you can leave Clemson, right?
Yeah.
There's 49 other states and a number of other universities, and I'm not saying you should. It's a great university. And we're both living in South Carolina now, so.
Yeah. I've been to 48 other states.
Which one are you missing?
I'm missing Hawaii and, believe it or not, North Dakota. And both of those are great birdie places. I have, no windmills to tilt at in either North Dakota or Hawaii, but I just haven't made it there. I need to get to North Dakota for the sparrows, and I need to get to Hawaii I need to get to Hawaii. Right. So, but, Clemson's been a good place for us in many ways, but I also, I sort of have a philosophy of range maps. And so I'm able to go to these other places from my home range and on speaking engagements. As I was just in Yosemite last week, where I had a chance to read with 2 great poets, Ada Limon, the immediate past poet laureate of the U.S., and Jane Hirschfield, and having a chance to read with those poets in Yosemite, at 9,000 feet, right, with Clark's nutcrackers and Williamson sapsuckers around us was quite the treat. But then to come back home down to 700 feet above sea level and oppressive humidity versus the aridity of the West, gives me a chance to compare and contrast home here and around Clemson to the other places where I wander. So I've tried to make up for sort of that lost time spatially by wandering where I can and sort of absorbing those other landscapes.
Which there are a number of. My wife and I have been blessed. We were in Alaska a couple of months ago for 3 weeks, and that closed the loop on the second time we've been to all 50 states. So we've been really fortunate as far as we've done a lot of international travel. I imagine we've been to 40 different countries or something along those lines. But if you spent your entire life and never left the continental United States, but traveled it extensively, it would be a rich, fulfilling travel life. There is so much to see and so much to do. And there's as much variety among the people of this country as there are through Western Europe or anywhere else. I mean, you can talk about French and German and English and Danish and all those things and look at them as separate cultures and whatnot. But if you talk about the Deep South, if you talk about California, if you talk about the Northeast, if you talk about the Midwest, those differences are at least as large as you find throughout Europe or other places, the South and Central America or the Africas. So by the way, before I forget, when you were in Yosemite, did you see the ghosts of John Muir and Teddy Roosevelt? And I mean, did those thoughts go through your head? I always remember those black and white pictures of those two men on that 3-day camping trip they did.
Yeah.
And all of the work that they did. Any of that cross your mind while you were there, or you pretty focused on the other stuff?
Constantly.
Okay.
I'm constantly in conversations with dead people, thinking about Muir and Roosevelt and sort of our ideals of what wildness or wilderness are, but then also being at the Soda Springs, right, next to Parsons Lodge, and thinking about the first people who would have been making treks to that elevation, for the summer to get cool or maybe to have a drink of fizzy water that was coming out of the ground for many of the same reasons that anybody else would. So I sort of think, Scott, about the train of human history and then sort of where the bumps come along or where we get off the rails of being human to one another. And so being out in Yosemite gave me a chance to not only try to catch my breath because I was at 9,000 feet, but also just to think about maybe what Muir would have been thinking in that space, but also if Muir was thinking about what was going on with other people who used to occupy that space. So my thoughts linger on sort of the romantic for a second, and then they go to the historic, and I steep myself in that, while I'm watching the birds. I had a chance during a writing session. Ada Limon had given this prompt and allowed us to go outside, and I climbed up on this rock. No one had taken this perch yet, and it was higher than any place else, and I thought I could see some stuff. But I got up to the top of that rock, Scott, and on top of that rock wasn't a nice, soft, mossy pad. It wasn't bare rock. It was probably generations of marmot shit up there on top of that rock. Pardon my French.
That's all right.
But
marmots aren't easily offended.
So it was all that dung, right? That was just up there. And initially I was kind of like, well, I'll just find a spot to sit here so I can write through this prompt. But then I began to think about myself as a colonizer on this marmot high ground and how the marmots were going to think about me coming up there where they had already planted their flag or their shat anyway, and what that meant to them. So then that took me to this place of thinking about Muir and thinking about Roosevelt and thinking about the American West and sort of my place in all of it. So when you ask the question, did I think about any of that? I can't stop thinking about it. It's sort of constant. And quite frankly, the only thing that sometimes gets me away from thinking that deeply is, some bird flies across my field of view, or I hear something different or familiar that literally calls to me, and then I can sort of be in the moment with the bird, and then maybe the bird takes me back through history too.
Well, that's spectacular. I'm going to back you up a little bit. You mentioned that you're constantly talking to dead people. Mm-hmm. Do you have go-to dead people? Are you looking for these guys to keep you in the bumpers, or is it situational? Do you say, okay, here's something that I need some help with. I'll get some help from some of my living friends, but one of the advantages of being an educated man, of having read a lot, is you do have access to the thoughts of great men and great women throughout history. So I am curious, and I am not asking facetiously because I do the same thing. I want to know who you talk to and when you do, and are you comforted by the directions and the answers that they give you?
Well, that's a great question. I've had this long trending conversation with John James Audubon because I'm learning who he was or is. And so I'm constantly asking him questions, but also just sort of, and and sometimes the conversations are three-way. So sometimes it's me with Audubon and Thoreau, right? Because then I can sort of get Thoreau and Audubon going, and I can just sit back and listen and learn.
Now, the Clemson website mentions that you consider Audubon your ornithological nemesis.
Yeah.
So incorporate that into your answer, if you would, please. I had that down for later in the conversation, but since you brought the man up, help me understand that.
Well, growing up, I mean, he was a hero to me, right? He was maybe the first historical ornithologist that I knew of because he was presented as sort of this frontiersman who watched birds. And then it didn't take long to learn that he was killing birds. Kill a bird or two for science. Okay, I get it. But then, as I grew older, I learned that Audubon not only was killing birds, he was killing lots of birds for science, but not really for science. He was killing them not to paint so much as Audubon had this bloodlust. And so you read his own words, you read what Audubon wrote, and he would talk about needing to secure a bird or two, and he'd end up with 50, right? So, that began to tilt me in one way towards this side of nemesis. And I write about having killed birds early in my life and even about being a hunter. The reason that I don't hunt wild turkeys anymore is because there are so many other birds in the woods for me to watch. And wild turkeys don't provide enough sustenance for the effort. I'd rather see them strutting alive than on my plate dead.
So if we go back to Audubon for a second,
Yeah.
there is a conflict, right, between the great science that he did. He was obviously a brilliant artist.
Mm-hmm.
And we look at that conflict, and as part of it is we're looking at it through the kaleidoscope of today's view. But don't we have some of those same conflicts with Teddy Roosevelt? I mean, maybe our great conversations, but you use the term bloodlust. The man went down to Africa to hunt for a year, and he shot buffalo. He certainly killed more animals than were needed for science.
He shot everything.
If I can summarize the way you described Audubon, right? So we get natural history museums and the value of having specimens, but do we really need 187 northern cardinals
No.
to get our point across?
No, we don't. I'm going to play one-upsmanship with Audubon and Roosevelt. And the one-upsmanship is really a despicable sort of tally in that John James Audubon he enslaved people, and he promoted enslavement.
Well, we've gone into an area that goes beyond taking northern cardinals.
We have gone into a very different kind of area. And even John James Audubon, his biographers disagree. I personally am going to have to see the 23andMe or 23 and John James to not think so. But his mother is listed or has been cited as being a Haitian Creole chambermaid. So mix into that what you will. When I hear Creole, when I hear Haitian, certain things come to mind. So, and then you go to New Orleans, and John James Audubon is in the African American Museum. And let me tell you, is one thing that New Orleans will parse apart, and that is race. And so here you have someone who I'm having a conversation with about identity. I'm having a conversation with about how he identified birds. I'm having conversations with him about whether or not he identified with birds. And I can read his words. I can read Audubon's words, and most people don't. Most people look at that genius artwork and let it go at that. But John James Audubon sort of damned himself by what he wrote about his actions. Fortunately, he was pretty explicit in what he wrote. And some people would say that maybe he was hyperbolic in that sense. But, for example, when he wrote about encountering an escaped enslaved man in a bayou, he went on to tell the story of how he came to eat dinner with this man that night, that he had rescued his family from other plantations. And then the next day, Audubon needs to get on his way to bird some more and kill some more birds. And instead of helping these people along to find liberty, he has them re-enslaved. So,
And you think that takes the edge off a little bit.
right. And so Scott, it's those conversations, when I can just say, man, what were you thinking? Did these people mean so little as humans that you would have them bondaged again? But then you didn't care about life, John James, really, because you killed all these birds. You dug into the graves of indigenous and fondled skulls. So all of that, to have a conversation with John James about that, and then to ask Henry David Thoreau, to ask Hank to weigh in it's great, because I've watched them argue, and I've watched Thoreau point fingers at John James Audubon. So, Thoreau has been tremendously helpful in ways, not that he's perfect, but John James really wants to spend more time talking about himself than he really does about birds. So what I want to get John James Audubon, I really want to get him a cell phone so that he can take selfies and maybe kill fewer birds. And Thoreau already has one, so he can call his mom. But these conversations with these people and bringing them forward into my life helps me establish some sort of context in my relationship with birds and with nature and with other people. So, Faulkner said, the past is never past, and it isn't. Audubon surrounds us in name and in sort of reputation. If you say the name Audubon, even if it's on the side of a sewage truck, people see the name Audubon and they say, oh, that must be a green sewage truck. They must do special stuff to shit so that it's environmentally acceptable. And so that name carries great weight, that I think anytime something carries great weight, we need to make sure our thumbs are off the scale, and understand what that weight really means.
And that is an extremely hard thing to do, to get our thumbs off the scale.
Oof.
And you and I, who have spent some decades here on this earth, our thumbs are more likely to be on the scale.
Yep.
Right? Some things harden in our mind a little bit, and thoughts and ideas, and it's difficult to push back against those. And you have to be remarkably open-minded, in my view, for that to occur, to be able to say, I was going to say, I understand. I probably don't. But if we're looking at Audubon, I'm willing to take a look at the balance between the birds that he killed and the artwork and the inspiration that he inspired and the curiosity that he brought to so many people. I'm willing to take a look at that and say, I don't know if those balance, but it's worth a discussion. But to your point, you throw slavery onto the mix, that just kind of blows the rest of that crap out of the water. And for our listeners today, because we're not going to do all this today, Drew has graciously agreed to join a panel that I'm going to have in the next month or two, where we're going to discuss exactly that. We're going to discuss what it's like to be Black in America and to be a Black birder as much as we can. And so I will let everybody know when that comes up. But as you can tell from the last few minutes, it's going to be an exciting, thoughtful conversation with some people that I think you're really going to enjoy hearing from. One of them is Scott Edwards at Harvard, whose podcast was released just today. We're looking at August 25th when this is being recorded. And the third member of the panel, who Drew and I are assuming will join us, but it's not fair to call him out until he's actually been invited. But it's going to be an amazing panel, amazing conversation. Let's back up now and talk about Drew a little bit. Drew, clearly you're so much more. You're a husband, you're a father, you're a professor, you're also an author and a poet and a wildlife biologist. Is that fair, if I'm picking words, to define your career, not to define you as a man, but to define your career? Are those reasonably close?
Yes, Scott. I do all of those things. Part of it, I think, is an undiagnosed attention deficit disorder, or maybe I should say self-diagnosed. I get bored pretty easily, and so I like I like spinning plates or juggling pins or whatever it is to juggle. So yeah, all those things are things that I do. Some of the things.
All right, well, tell us what classes you're teaching. What is it that you teach at Clemson?
It's funny because next week I'll be in with my department chair who wanted to have a conversation about sort of this evolving role that I've had. Well, I teach a class that I call conservation and cultural ornithology. And that class revolves around not just identifying birds, but identifying with birds. That's sort of my mantra. And it means identifying with birds across the geospatial range of at least um, American history and the entire range of the species. So, for example, I can take students down to the Ace Basin, our beautiful Ace Basin on the coastal plain, the low country of South Carolina, and we can see tundra swans down there really at the terminus of their winter range. And we can watch those swans, we can listen to them, we can come up with the essential field marks for that huge white bird. But then we can also talk about those birds making use of rice impoundments and rice marsh that enslaved people built. And then we can talk about having that bird in common with Alaskan natives, because that tundra swan is going to migrate some of them back to the North Slope and places in Alaska that I've had that you and I have had the fortune to visit on our own occasion. So I can talk about a hemispheric range of tundra swans. I can talk about, possibly Harriet Tubman seeing those tundra swans much more abundantly in the mid-Atlantic, but maybe also about enslaved people that she helped to liberate, seeing them in the low country of South Carolina. So that class, Scott, I used to require students to know about 125 birds. I'm much more flexible now, and I really want students not so much to be able to, by rote memorization, know a bird, but by how they feel to know a bird.
So, do the students know that coming in, that they're not just going to learn field marks and height and weight and range and vocalizations of a tundra swan, but you're going to bring in Harriet Tubman and slavery and Alaskan natives and all of these different things? Am I aware of that when I walk into the first day of class? Or am I surprised when I get the syllabus and discover that this is as much sociology as it is ornithology?
Well, I hope you're surprised a bit. Honestly, with sort of the atmosphere now, I keep waiting for somebody to complain about it, to say, oh, I didn't expect race to be a part of this. I didn't expect history. I was offended because you said that enslaved people made it possible for black rail ranges to possibly spread during that time. So it's some of the students, I think, know. I think by reputation, students talk and they learn. But part of, I think, learning is the surprise of convergence, right? How these things, these field marks for birds can come together with what I call feel marks, and that how you feel about something can have an impact on how you see that thing, and then ultimately for birds on how you conserve them, right? So if you feel a certain way about a bird, maybe it inspires you to think about how you don't just watch that bird, but you want more of those birds to watch. And so then you begin to move into this realm of empathy that moves you towards being a conservationist, but
So,
also this role of empathy that leads you to being a humanist, and you're like a humanitarian, and you're like, wow, how could they treat people that way? I want to treat my fellow human being better. I also want to treat birds better. And at the end of the course, hopefully people are leaving elevated in some way beyond just field marks and bird identification, Scott.
So it's almost exactly the opposite of hardcore listing. Racing through the field, checking off the sparrow, checking off the tundra, moving on. And by the way, no offense to people who list, there are as many different levels of listing as there are listers. But we both know people who just, all they want to do is check that off. They don't have 2 minutes to watch the bird, much less time to think, gee, what would Harry Tubman have thought of this? Or what would Audubon have thought? How many of
Right.
these swans would he have shot?
There you go.
While he's sitting there. Did Tubman have time to notice these swans with everything else that she was doing? Or was that one of the sacrifices, the many sacrifices she made, was she gave that up? Or was she somehow upheld or inspired by the things in nature? And I suppose those are the conversations you've had.
Yeah, I've birded in the field with Harriet, and she knows a lot, right? And the names that she calls the birds are different than some of the names that I know, but she does a great barred owl call. And I mean, and she's used that in the woods to help, people that she is liberating know where she is. So, those conversations, and I invite the students to have the conversations. I mean, look, we talked about Teddy Roosevelt. Let's not forget that Teddy Roosevelt had a mystic as basically his Secretary of the Interior. We think about Gifford Pinchot, who was asking the ghost of his dead wife for advice on national forest policy.
Maybe that's why Taft got rid of Pinchot when Taft was elected. Maybe he didn't want mystics in the cabinet. Which, by the way, would be a great title for a book you and I should write, Mystics in the Cabinet.
Yeah.
That would be an awesome, awesome thing. We have I just had a woman today agree to be on the podcast of the future. Her name is Lynn Scarlett. And she was Deputy Secretary of the Interior under George Bush. And for 4 months during that, she was the acting Secretary of the Interior, which meant she was 8th in line for the presidency. But anyway, we could have her in the book. We could ask her opinion on mystics. And she's a tremendous birding fan. She has cut off a number of conversations with me because she's had to go find a bird.
Oh, nice.
Which I think is a convenient excuse for people who just want to get off the phone with me. I had Cy Montgomery was a recent guest on the podcast, and she cut the podcast short because she was going to go swimming with a snapping turtle, and the people she was going swimming with were waiting in her living room. And so I'm thinking I might do a podcast on all the reasons people have used to end the podcast, because I think that'd be fascinating. Backing up to this thing, everything we've been talking about the last few minutes, I've read this phrase associated with you and your name more than once, which is connecting the conservation dots.
Mm-hmm.
So how does that relate to the class that you just described, to your conversations with the deceased? Where does connecting the conservation dots fit into your educating process?
Well, Scott, it's all about, I guess it's, kind of a personal string theory. And how many people have talked about pulling on one thread and the whole thing unraveling. I would rather take that thread that's unraveled and begin to stitch things together. I think about Scott Weidensall's book Of a Feather, which is a beautiful book that links history to birds.
Sitting right here.
And birding. Yeah. And I use that for quite a few years. As I don't really have a text anymore. I have recommended books for students, but to help understand, that a U.S. cavalryman was likely saved from that massacre at the Little Bighorn because they went birding. So, birds intervene in our lives in all sorts of ways. And I want students to be able to connect those dots. And to say, so one of the ways is I'll ask them to tell me your last bird story. And of course, I roll and people say, well, I don't have a bird story. I can't identify birds. And then I'll say, what'd you have for dinner last night or lunch or whatever? And sooner or later, somebody says, well, I had chicken. I had a chicken sandwich from that famous Southern chicken place. And I'm like, okay, there's your bird story, right? And they're like, yeah, but it was a chicken sandwich. Yeah, and a chicken is right, ding, 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 it's a bird. Or, yeah, I came out and I parked my car under this tree because it was the last parking space I could find. And I came back out and my car was covered in bird shat. Oh, there you go. There's a bird story. So to get people to a point in the class that birds just aren't these fleeting things that fly in and out of sight or earshot, but they are these beings that directly impact our lives in all sorts of ways. And for students to connect those dots, I figured out it's just as important if we're going to save birds, if we're not going to have another 3 billion birds depart from us in the next 50 years, people are going to have to care a different sort of way about things. Obviously just going out and having people identify birds and now having magical apps that can identify birds. Is that saving birds? Probably not. Maybe it's creating some appreciation for birds, which is a good thing, But I think ultimately there's some really hard and dirty work that has to be done in order for birds to be quote unquote saved. And that means people are going to have to put feelings on the lines. They're going to have to connect themselves to the plights of birds. I like to say, rather than thinking about, canaries in the coal mine, maybe we need to think about, maybe the birds are looking at us and saying, hey, these humans in the situation that they've put themselves in, maybe we need to fly the coop. Maybe we need to be the ones looking at humanity and saying, what you're doing to yourselves is not going to be good for us. Let's migrate elsewhere. So I want students to put themselves, if they can, in the place of a bird. I want them to see a warbler that's crossing the Gulf of Mexico on migration. I mean, that's a heroic thing. That's a miraculous
600
thing that's
a flight.
yeah, and that bird somehow ends up in your binocular view. And the life history of it, the ecology of it, that it's jumped off the Yucatan, and it made it. And so,
Which is a whole nother show, and of course Weidensaul's career, and we could discuss that all day as well. But going back to the dots and the teaching, so I'm guessing that you're teaching these students where the dots are, you're teaching them how to connect the dots, and then you're teaching them how to discover their own dots.
Yeah. I want them to see themselves as the first dot.
Okay.
That's the first thing. I want them really to look inside and understand who they are in the context of, in a natural context, so that they have ecologies that they share ranges with so many of these birds. Most of us in the contiguous US share ranges with American robins, but those birds that Roger Tory Peterson said everybody should know, those are birds that on the one hand are expanding their range, they're showing up in places earlier than they used to, but on the other hand, it's a bird that I don't see as many of anymore. Yeah. So I want those students, in the context of where they live, to have some understanding of what's going on around them, and birds are one of the meters that they can use to say, I remember as a kid hearing bobwhite quail at my grandpa's place, but I haven't heard a bobwhite quail in 5 years. Well, guess what, Scott? For most of these kids, that's 25% of their lives. That's a quarter of their lives. Or if they say, I haven't heard a quail since I went out with my grandmother and I was 10. That's half their lives. They haven't heard a bird that used to be common. Yeah. So when you can do that then and get them to say, okay, even within the frame of my young life, things have changed. Things have gone downhill for some birds. For some birds, for a few birds, it's gotten better. If I can get them to see that and communicate that, then I'm happy.
Well, that's a great goal. And I think, to your point, the loudest song that a bird can sing is the one we can no longer hear. Because when that moment hits you, when you realize, hey, I used to walk through this park, and if it was early morning especially, be overwhelmed by the sound, and now I'm more overwhelmed by the lack of sound.
Yeah.
But we don't notice that. It's much more difficult to notice something that's missing than something that is new, right? So if there's never been deer in the park and suddenly there are, it's like, holy crap, there's deer in the park. But if there used to be deer in the park and they're slowly disappearing, you maybe don't notice it first. And then one day you wake up and go, honey, didn't we used to see a lot of deer when we take our walks through here? And it wakes you up. And whether it's robins or sparrows or any other bird. And then you're right, we do have a couple of flames that are burning out there. We did do a lot of good work in the DDT area, and we brought back the osprey and the bald eagle and the brown pelicans. We've shown that we can win. Now, that one, of course, was a little easier than most because it was a single issue, right? If we get rid of the DDT, we can probably save these birds. Now we've got habitat loss. We've got death by glass. We've got feral cats. We've got so many things that we're dealing with that, as to your point, has brought us from 10 billion birds to 7 billion birds. And the canary in the cave thing resonates with people who think about it, because this isn't just birds. If the birds are disappearing, other things are going with them. And, that's on climate change. You throw climate change in there with with cats and glass and habitat, and suddenly you've got a Mount Rushmore of slaughtering birds, and we need to stop that, if for no other reason than selfish.
Mm-hmm.
Then
Mm-hmm.
because we're not going to exist beyond when we've killed everything else.
No, I mean, um, I think about this farm and seeing fireflies, right? And how important that is just for my psyche when fireflies used to be everywhere and we never thought they would just all disappear. But then, you have way too many pest companies who are willing to just spray clouds of whatever so that we'll live in a bugless world. And that's not where we want to be, because if we're in a bugless world, we're going to be in a birdless world.
And if we're in
And
a birdless world, we're gonna lose a lot of other things.
we're going to lose a lot of other things, including our minds.
Yes. Yes, and our humanity.
Yes, and our humanity.
And it's a dangerous thing. Drew, I wanna ask you, so again, there's a limit, unfortunately. You wrote a book in 2016 called Birding While Black.
Mm-hmm.
You wrote a book in 2017 called The Home Place: Memoirs of a Colored Man's Love Affair with Nature. And
Yep.
in the future, we're going to talk about those. But I want to highlight two of the things today. You wrote an article about a dozen years ago for Orion magazine about blackbirding, and you've
Yep.
written books of poetry. I would love for you to talk about that article. What prompted you to write it, which might appear obvious, so I apologize if people think it's a silly question. What impact you were hoping it had and what impact you think it might have. And then I'm going to impose upon you to read one of your poems.
Okay.
So let's talk about Orion and the article and the impetus and the results and the prayers and all those good things.
Well, I had my first piece for that I wrote for Orion a little bit before that was called Hope and Feathers, and it was about a trip taking students to South Africa and being the trip ornithologist and sort of all that entailed, which in part then led to this next piece, which was 9 Rules for the Black Bird Watcher. And I was asked by an editor if I had something to contribute to this section that they called enumeration in Orion. And I remember the editor asking me and saying, well, if you could get something to me in 2 weeks, that'd be good. He'd get me a draft. And I sat down, Scott, and I swear to you, in less than an hour, I was sending them back those 9 rules because I had lived them, right? And I had thought about them. As I told you, my brain is overactive. And so those things that stood out to me of being a Black bird watcher, some of them were societal, and so in that way, it was an immediate thing. I didn't really have to think about it. It just sort of flew off of my fingers, and I didn't expect. Matter of fact, I had taken a trip. Here's the thing. I had taken a trip up to Wisconsin to talk about the first piece that I had written for Orion and Hope and Feathers. And Jack Kloppenberg, I believe, was the professor who had invited me up to UW to talk about this piece on birding in Africa. And I was in my hotel room and a friend called me and said, oh my God, did you realize that this latest piece that you wrote for Orion is going viral? I didn't really know what viral was.
So the answer to your question was no.
No, I didn't. So anyway, that's where that came from. It was a lived experience. And then BirdNote, they wanted to produce a video and they did that. And so it sort of took off from there. But you asked me about dots earlier, and the dot that I know best is myself. And so if I'm wrong about myself, I have no one to penalize but me. And so a lot of what I choose to write about comes out of the first person.
Okay. Talk to me about some of the rules.
Well, one of those rules was don't wear a hoodie, and we had just come off of that shooting in Florida with Trayvon Martin, right? Where, he was wearing a hoodie, eating Skittles, and he was perceived as a threat, and he didn't make it home. And so don't wear a hoodie while birding, or else someone may see you as a threat, and maybe you don't get home from that.
Drew, you and I had a conversation before we started reporting the podcast, and I mentioned to you a friend of mine named Jerry Williams, who was police chief of Phoenix and is a Black woman and had 2 Black sons. These boys stood out for a number of reasons, including the fact they were both about 6'10". One of them played in the NBA. But I had moderated a forum, which I had mentioned to you, on racism and police and whatnot. And Jerry was kind enough to be on that panel. And the first rule she taught her boys was don't wear a hoodie. Nothing to do with birding. I doubt that they would notice a bird. Well, they're much closer to the bird heights than you and I are, but they're not. Just that was the first rule she taught her boys when they were growing up: is you guys can't wear hoodies. And what an asinine world where that is something that you have to teach people.
Well, think about that fundamental. Um, it sounds esoteric. Don't wear this, but then that's a really slippery, steep, long slope of don't wear this. Don't be here after this time. Pretty soon you're back in a sundown town, and you got to be out by dark, right?
Yes.
So those 9 rules were that kind of take, and it was so immediate because I felt it. I was living so much of it, Scott, that it didn't take long at all for me to write those. And honestly, we were sort of in a period of time when I was able to write those. And Orion's a great magazine. They've not faltered in this way. But sometimes I think about the writing that I do now. And on the one hand, there are those days where I'm waiting to be canceled. And then there are the other days where I'm wondering why I haven't been, that maybe I need to write a little more strongly towards these things.
So you're
But
suggesting that not being canceled is an indicator that you haven't been out there strong enough and forward enough? Or a
sometimes, yeah.
possible indicator?
Yeah, sometimes, right? Sometimes. But I also believe in the spoonful of sugar thing, right? So if I'm out with you and we're watching painted buntings and you're having a hard time seeing the painted bunting in the edge of that rice field in this tangly stuff where they've built their nests, I know by the ecology of painted buntings and the work that some of my students have done that that painted bunting is going to go out to forage in that rice field. And when the painted bunting goes out to forage in the rice field, I can talk about how the rice field got there.
Okay.
And in that way, I haven't come straight at someone and said, "Oh, okay, today I'm gonna make you uncomfortable by talking about the institution of enslavement, and yeah, we might see a few birds too." So again, you see the color I have on today. It's not exactly camo, but I don't like for people to see me coming. I love the ambush. I
Okay.
love I love the sort of, all of it is true. There's the painted bunting. There it is. It loves nesting in this stuff, but it's going to forage out there. And so understand that the history of the people who created that thing, that place 200 years ago is tied to this bird's life now and why you can see it now. And all of a sudden, I'm not asking you to step out there in the pluff mud and get sucked up to your knees like they did, but I'm asking you to sort of mentally be in that space and say, oh, this place didn't just happen. Forests had to be taken out, and then people at hard labor from dawn to dusk and then beyond that had to create these to make this. So again, I think I would probably have been more successful at being canceled if I just came out and did that blunt force trauma, but I prefer bird force trauma. So
Well, because I think your goal is to affect change and not necessarily just draw. It's easy to say things that are explosive and different. And oh my God, Lanham's a son of a bitch and da 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 da. But really, who have you changed? What impact have you had? I mean, in a way, it's just a self glorification. But if you
yeah,
take the time and work through these things, you're probably opening a few hearts and minds and
I
maybe
hope so,
changing the
Scott.
way people look at things. And doing that through birding is a miraculous thing. Other people might choose to try to do it through cooking or, whatever it might be, but birding's a fantastic way to do it.
I try.
And I applaud you for that. I mean, I haven't had nearly the challenges, and I try to understand and try to respect, but never thinking that that's a table that I can sit at, which is kind of a weird place to be. But that being said, I think it's amazing what you've been doing and the work that you've been doing. We'll put a link up here so hopefully people can dig up that article and read it. I
Awesome.
don't care what color you are. It's an important article to read. And toward that end, I had warned you earlier, Drew, I'm going to ask you to recommend a book to the viewers in the audience. And
Hmm.
that's your call what that book is.
You know, one book I'm going to recommend, um, a book that has been critical to me and in some ways is a holy text, not because everything in it is right, but because it's beautiful writing and it creates in me a sense of oneness with nature and a desire to be out in it and to be a part of it. And that is Aldo Leopold's A Sand County Almanac. And that book was published posthumously. Leopold died helping a neighbor fight a fire back in the mid 40s, and that book was published posthumously in 1946 after being turned down a bunch of times by a bunch of publishers. And it is now, I think, been published in something like 17 or 18 languages. And yeah, it was written by a patrician, upper Midwest white man who, again, wasn't perfect, but I knew his daughter, Estella Jr. I've worked with that foundation a good bit, and Leopold's words are transcendent. And anytime I can read something that's transcendent, that means that I can, in some ways, live those words. And so Leopold, in many ways, has done that for me. I began to relate to it as a child, as a preteen, and it has stuck with me now as I'm 60 years old. So Aldo Leopold's A Sand County Almanac, and you can get that book used for 50 cents.
Well, thank you very much. I'll be investing my 50 cents today. I'm familiar with some of Leopold's writings, but not that one, and I will look forward to reading it. So thank you very much. Anything that you want to tell the audience that's upcoming? You have a new book coming out or a speaking tour or what's going on? This is let's share it now and get them excited about it.
Well, Scott, I've got a children's book that's in the artist's, in the illustrator's hands called The Bird I Became with Enchanted Lion Press. I have another book under contract with them that's also I'm working on. The big book is Range Maps, Birds, Blackness, and Loving Nature Between the Two. That's Farrar, Straus, and Giroux. Hopefully that book is out in the next couple of years. I've got an operetta that is about
Not on the
John James
list of things
Audubon.
I expected. If you had said, Scott, pick the 6 things you think Drew might bring up, operetta would not have been, 7th or 8th maybe, but certainly not in the top 6.
Well,
Tell us about the operetta.
Well, we've been talking about John James Audubon, and so I have been working a short story / novelette that has been adapted by Gabriella Lena Franks, the composer, my composer, and this hopefully debuts with the St. Paul Chamber Orchestra in January of 26. So I've heard it. I've been in the room sitting shoulder to shoulder and heard the wonderful baritone who will be singing. And it's something else to hear your words on strings and on winds and then to know that you were seminal in creating that. So, like I said, I'm probably, attention deficit in some way, Scott, but I love doing different things. I still have an exhibit at the North Carolina State Museum that's called Tweetable Audubon. That's been running now. It's coming up on, I think, 2.5 years. So, those are things I've been working on, kind of a secret thing with Nick Cave, the artist for the Smithsonian. We'll see whether that still goes forward because of what's been going on at the Smithsonian. So lots of stuff, that I'm working on. Always got an essay that I'm behind on that I owe someone, various and sundry podcasts here and there, this being the latest. So I'm looking forward to, by the way, I don't listen to my podcast. People have to tell me about them because it's just sort of weird listening to yourself. But I'm just grateful for the space that you give for the conversation. So
Well,
thank you.
I'm grateful that you're here and sharing it. So a couple of things. Number one, assuming you're going to be there opening night in January, if I can impose on our friendship for a ticket, I would love to join you. I think that would be a really special thing
I will
to be
find
there.
you. I'll find you a ticket, man. No problem.
Thank you very much. And number two, I promised the audience, and I already had you committed to this, but I want to close with one of your poems.
All right.
So whichever poem you want to share, and tell us what book it's from, because I know you've got more than one book of poetry out.
This is from my first, well, this is 1.5. books. This is Sparrow Envy from Hub City Press in Spartanburg, South Carolina, and I'm going to share one of my favorite poems called Love for a Song.
And by the way, we'll put a link for that book down below. As our podcast try to get stronger and better every time, that's one of the things we're doing now is we're starting to add links. So you'll find one for Leopold's book for your 50-cent investment. And more important, you'll find one for Drew's book. So please, Drew, share away.
Thank you, Scott. Love for a Song. Love is barter. Love is bits of affection traded for pieces of adoration. Love is desire doled out on the whippoorwill's summer wanting. It is our craving for the meadowlark's ringing song, our longing for spring's greening from our sun-starved spirits down to our bare-toed roots. We seek the winding path and wander until we find the sweet spots, blackwater, cypress swamp, tall grass, prairie sweep, that place where moonlight glancing off of tide-slicked stones makes us weep. We want the wild soul, and a shadow-dwelling wood thrush heaps it on us in self-harmonizing sonata. We revel in wildflowers' bloom and marvel in the migratory sojourns of birds dodging falling stars. Sink yourself deep in the dizzying dance of pollen-drunk bees. Find hope in the relieved canopies of the tallest trees. Wind and water, storm and surf, they can move us to other ends. Therein is the turn-on. That is the honey-sweet seduction. Nature asks only that we notice a sunrise here, a sunset there. The surge, that overwhelming, inexplicable thing in a swallow's joyous flight, or the dawning of new light that melds heart and head into sensual soul. In that moment of truly seeing, that is love.
That is spectacular. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Thank you,
so
Scott.
I'm guessing I can get you to sign my copy when I get it.
Of course.
I'm looking forward to that. Of course, that might have to be done over a cigar and a bourbon, so we'll see how that goes.
Well, yeah, that's just compensation. I'll take
Fair
that
enough.
any day.
Fair enough. Drew, thank you so much, man. This has been great. I got to tell you, I've got these other note cards here with all the things I wanted to talk to you about that we did not get to, but we'll get to them next time. And and there will be a next time. I'm looking forward to that. For those of you that are watching here and you stay till the end, we're going to put up my email address right now on screen. And you've got any questions for me, send them. If you've got any questions for Drew, send them to me and I'll forward them. You heard him talk about how busy his schedule is, so no guarantee on if and how soon an answer, but at least he'll know people were listening and ask the questions. If you get an opportunity to subscribe and put and check like and put down some comments, I appreciate that. It helps us grow the audience, and the more people that hear the message, for example, Drew just shared, the better off the world will be. And I want to share that with as many people as possible. So please do that. Stay tuned for field notes. Regular listeners will know that's the part I attach to the end of these podcasts where I pick a single bird or animal or park or issue and talk about that for a couple of minutes. Lets me go off and pontificate and pretend that I know stuff. And as always, stay safe and stay curious. And thank you so much for being a part of this. Hello, and welcome to this edition of Field Notes. This is the 8th one we've done together, and I'm pretty excited about it. Usually when we do these, we discuss a bird or an animal or maybe a park, but today we're going to do things just a little bit differently, and I want to share those with you. If you happen to have noticed that my eyes are completely dilated, it may be because I just came back from the eye doctor and had some testing done, or it may be that my eyes were opened by the subject of today's field notes, Henry David Thoreau, a great American naturalist, philosopher, and writer. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. If you are listening to this after having just listened to Drew Lam's podcast, again, number 008, then you know that we discussed Thoreau and how important he is to Drew and his thought process. And I just thought it'd be a fun one to continue with. If you haven't listened to the podcast with Drew, I strongly recommend it. It's a deeply philosophical podcast, similar to the field notes that we're doing today. Mr. Thoreau was born in 1817. He died in 1862 as a young man, and he lived at Walden Pond from 1845 to 1847. probably the two most famous years of his life. Most people have some kind of jog or trigger when they hear Walden or Walden Pond. He published in 1854 a book about that time called Walden, or also known as Life in the Woods. And many of us read that, at least in my days in high school, it was required reading. That was back in the early 70s. It was a study of simple living, nature, and self-reliance, which is what he focused on for the 2 years that he lived out there on his own. He built his own cabin, he farmed, he wrote, he observed, he thought, he learned. It was pretty cool. When he wrote the book, his most famous line, and almost all of us have heard this line, although we don't always know who it's attributed to, but this is it. It's a sad line, and I think it's true for an awful lot of people. The mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation. That is a chilling line right there. But I think it is true. And I think that is because so many of us don't take the time to pull back a little bit and spend some time thinking about our lives, our families, the careers we've chosen, the places we've picked to live, and how we might change those to better all of the other things. And instead, we just kind of trudge forward, perhaps thinking that that's the only way we can do things, which is not necessarily the case, of course. And if you're feeling any sense of that, by the way, not that you came here for my advice or opinion, but I will share it. And it's just a modified version of Thoreau. But take some time and kind of reevaluate. Take a look at your life, the people that are in it, the work that you do, the hobbies that you enjoy, the place that you live, and see if that's where you were hoping to be today. And if not, what is it that you can do to possibly fix or change some of those things? That could be as powerful and as simple as just changing your attitude, or maybe you need to change careers or friends or location. So there's a lot of different ways to look at that, but it is always worth doing some kind of self-assessment and getting away from, as Thoreau described it, the quiet desperation. During his time on Walden, by the way, Thoreau spent a night in jail. That was in 1846, and he was jailed for not paying his taxes. He was not thrilled about that, and it led him to spend the balance of his time at Walden Pond thinking about the acts and principle and ethics of civil disobedience. And only 2 years after he left Walden, he published a book, a series of essays called Civil Disobedience, and it was on pushing back against the government when you think things are wrong. That's another one of those challenging issues, because generally civil disobedience is a polite way of saying breaking the law. And for many people, that right away is just a negative. That makes it a bad thing. For other people, their strong belief is that the only way to get laws that they think are repressive or unfair changed is through civil disobedience. And that can be as simple as blocking traffic, in an intersection, or chaining yourself to a tree, or a variety of other things. But Thoreau wrote an essay about that, and it is an exciting and interesting book for those of us that have been involved in some of those issues in our life, and I encourage you to take a look at it. The book is thought to have influenced, among others, Gandhi and Martin Luther King. Let's assume for a moment that's true. I've heard and read it in a number of places, which doesn't always make it true. I understand that, but maybe in this case it does. Imagine having written something so powerful that you influenced two of the greatest men in the history of mankind, Gandhi and Martin Luther King. That is extraordinary. I think that the philosophy that he espoused in that government that is best, which, I'm sorry, I said that wrong. Government is best, which governs least. And I think a lot of us can agree on that. We take a look at things, and again, I try not to make this show political, and I'm trying not to do that today, but I do think there are an awful lot of examples currently and in the recent past of government overreach. Of course, we all feel that way when we don't agree with a law. That's when we think that there's overreach. And when we do agree with a law, that's when we think, doggone it, the government's doing a good job. But either way, the best way to know the difference between those and how to act on those is to read, is to inform yourself. And Thoreau does that. And so, again, I push you back toward Drew Lanham's podcast, or my podcast with Drew as a guest. He was terrific. And he talked a lot about some of the challenges that we face in trying to overcome some of our own prejudices, and not just racial, but just the things that have built up over a period of time. And I think it is interesting and worth studying. And of course, backing this back up to nature, which is the focus of this, is Thoreau spending 2 years farming and building and observing and listening and watching nature and studying that. and how it influenced him. And we can bring that into our own lives, whether it's a week-long trip or a weekend trip, or just spend a couple hours walking along a beach or in a backyard garden or at a park. There is no downside to those things, and there is a ton of upside. So thank you for listening. I know this one was a little different, as was the podcast with Drew, but I hope you found it to be of some value, and I look forward to your comments. Send me some emails if you've got them, and I will read and respond to those, I promise. And for everybody, as always, stay safe and stay curious.